There are cars that changed history, cars that won Le Mans, cars that made Britain proud. And then there is the Austin Allegro, a car so spectacularly, so completely, so almost impressively wrong that it didn't just fail. It became a punchline that an entire nation has been repeating for 50 years. This is the story of how British Leyland took everything that was working, ignored all of it, and built something so comprehensively terrible that it arguably achieved a kind of immortality. The Allegro outlasted its makers, outlasted its critics, and outlasted every sensible car of its era. Failure, it turns out, has a longer memory than success. To understand why the Allegro failed so completely, you need to understand the world it arrived into, and more importantly, the car it was supposed to replace. The Austin 1100 and 1300 were, by any serious measure, genuinely brilliant motor cars. Designed by Alec Isigonis, the man who gave Britain the Mini, the 1100 launched in 1962, and within 2 years had become the best-selling car in the country. It held that position for most of the decade, not because of clever marketing, not because of a lack of competition, but because it was excellent in the ways that actually matter. Its hydroelastic suspension gave it a ride quality that embarrassed cars costing twice the price. Its front-wheel drive handled with a composure that larger, more expensive cars couldn't match. And it did all of this while remaining economical, reliable, and priced for the family that needed a proper car but wasn't made of money. These were the cars that ordinary British families trusted completely, the kind Dad drove to work, Mum took to the shops, and the whole family piled into on a Sunday afternoon without a second thought about whether it would get them home. Millions owned one. Millions more wished they did. By the early 1970s, that car needed a successor. The 1100 and 1300 were aging, and the competition wasn't waiting. Ford's Escort, Vauxhall's Viva, and increasingly capable European cars from Volkswagen and Renault were pressing hard. British Leyland, the enormous and increasingly troubled conglomerate that had absorbed Austin, along with most of the British motor industry, needed to get this right. They did not get it right. Before we get to the car itself, it's worth spending a moment on the company responsible for it, because understanding British Leyland in the early 1970s explains a great deal about why the Allegro turned out the way it did. British Leyland Motor Corporation had been formed in 1968 through the merger of British Motor Holdings and Leyland Motors, a government-encouraged union of almost every significant British car manufacturer that remained. Austin, Morris, MG, Triumph, Rover, Jaguar, all of them now under one enormous, unwieldy roof. On paper, it looked like strength. In practice, it was organised chaos. The company was managing too many brands, too many factories, too many models, and too many workforces with long-standing rivalries and entrenched working practices that resisted every attempt at rationalisation. Industrial action was constant. The 1970s would bring strikes, stoppages, and walkouts on a scale that made consistent quality control not just difficult, but essentially impossible on many production lines. Management and workforce regarded each other with a mutual suspicion that occasionally hardened into outright hostility, and the cars that came off the production lines bore the evidence of that atmosphere in ways that customers noticed immediately and remembered for a very long time. Into this environment, British Leyland's designers and engineers were tasked with creating the car that would replace one of the best-selling vehicles in British automotive history. The budget was limited, the timeline was pressured, the internal politics were ferocious. And the man who had designed the original, Alec Isigonis himself, was now sidelined, his influence within the company reduced to a fraction of what it had been during the years when he was producing masterpieces. The result, launched in 1973, was the Austin Allegro. Let's start with the thing everyone remembers first, because it tells you almost everything you need to know about the decisions being made at British Leyland in the early 1970s. The Allegro had a square steering wheel. Not quite square. British Leyland's designers called it the quartic wheel, a rounded square shape that they argued was ergonomically superior to a conventional round one, easier to get in and out past, more comfortable to hold for long periods, more modern in appearance. These were, on paper, defensible arguments. The problem was that every single person who sat behind it, from the motoring journalists who drove the press cars to the showroom, customers who sat in the demonstrators to the ordinary British families who bought one and lived with it for several years, every single one of them thought it looked absolutely ridiculous. The quartic wheel became the symbol of everything that seemed wrong with the Allegro, not because it was catastrophically dangerous or technically unworkable, but because it was a solution to a problem that nobody had, imposed on a car that didn't need it, by people who seemed more interested in being seen to innovate than in actually building something that worked better than what came before. It was change for the sake of change in a car that desperately needed change in entirely different areas. British Leyland eventually replaced it with a conventional round steering wheel in 1975, 2 years after launch. The fact that this was considered a significant improvement tells you something about where the bar had been set. The steering wheel was the most famous problem, but it wasn't the first thing you noticed about the Allegro. The first thing you noticed was the shape. The Austin 1100 it replaced was a clean, elegant, well-proportioned small car. One of those designs that ages gracefully because it was never trying too hard in the first place. The Allegro was trying very hard indeed, and the effort showed in all the wrong ways. The design was the work of Harris Mann, a British Leyland stylist who would also go on to design the Princess and the Triumph TR7, a record that perhaps deserves some scrutiny. The Allegro was bulbous and rounded in a way that struck most people as either aggressively modern or faintly comic, depending on their disposition, but rarely as attractive. The rear end in particular attracted almost universal derision, high, boxy, oddly proportioned, with a boot lid that seemed to belong to a different, slightly larger car that had been trimmed down awkwardly to fit. The press were not kind. They called it the flying potato. They called it the all-agro. They noted that its proportions suggested a car that had been inflated slightly beyond its original design, like a balloon in the approximate shape of a vehicle. Road testers who had been genuinely enthusiastic about the 1100 and 1300 found themselves struggling to find neutral language for a car whose appearance struck them and their readers as a significant step in the wrong direction. The public, when it arrived in showrooms in May 1973, looked at it, compared it mentally to the Ford Escort and the Vauxhall Viva parked alongside it, and in many cases went home and thought about it for rather longer than British Leyland would have liked. Here is where the Allegro story gets genuinely complicated, because underneath all the styling decisions and ergonomic experiments, there was actual engineering going on, and some of it was, in principle, genuinely impressive. The Allegro used hydrogas suspension, an evolution of the hydrolastic system that had given the 1100 its famously comfortable ride. Where hydrolastic used fluid-filled displacers connected front to rear on each side, hydrogas replaced the fluid with a gas-over-fluid arrangement that was lighter, potentially more sophisticated, and designed to give an even better ride without compromising the handling that had made its predecessor so good. On paper, hydrogas was a serious piece of engineering. In practice, the Allegro's suspension was set up with a softness that prioritized comfort to the point where the handling suffered noticeably. The car rolled in corners in a way that unsettled drivers who expected the composed, grippy behavior of the car it replaced. It pitched under braking. It felt, to put it plainly, as though it wasn't entirely sure which direction it intended to travel, and wasn't in any particular rush to decide. The ride quality was indeed good. On smooth roads, the Allegro floated along with a composure that its rivals couldn't match. But Britain's roads in the early 1970s were not all smooth, and the Allegro's suspension, when presented with a sharp pothole or an uneven surface, responded with a sudden wallowing motion that reminded drivers unhelpfully that there was quite a lot of car trying to settle itself after an unexpected disturbance. Later versions with revised suspension settings were considerably better. But first impressions in the automotive world are stubborn things, and the first impression of the Allegro's ride and handling was not one that many early owners rushed to correct in conversation. One of the most baffling decisions in the entire Allegro story, and there is genuine competition for that title, was the estate version. Austin 1100 and 1300 estate had been a practical, sensible, genuinely useful family car, popular with exactly the kind of buyer who needed to move children, dogs, pushchairs, and the weekly shop in a single journey without performing an engineering puzzle in the car park. When the Allegro replaced the 1100 and 1300, customers quite reasonably expected an Allegro estate to follow shortly afterwards. They waited. The Allegro estate, when it finally arrived, was the Allegro Maxi Traveller, later simply called the Allegro Estate, and it was a car that managed to be smaller inside than the hatchback it was based on, thanks to the way the body had been extended. This was not a trivial achievement in the wrong direction. Customers who measured the boot space then measured the boot space of the Ford Escort estate parked next to it, and then looked at the price difference, tended to reach conclusions that British Leyland found commercially inconvenient. The estate version was also, if anything, even less attractive than the saloon, which was a considerable achievement given that the saloon had started from a fairly low visual baseline. Sales of the estate were modest. The Allegro arrived at a time when British Leyland's production quality was, to be generous about it, variable. The industrial disputes that plagued the company throughout the 1970s meant that cars built on certain days, in certain factories, during certain periods of the decade, were noticeably better or worse than cars built at other times, and customers had no reliable way of knowing which category their new car fell into until they'd driven it home and lived with it for a few weeks. The Allegro accumulated a reputation for rust with a speed that alarmed even people who had grown accustomed to British cars of the era not being especially resistant to the weather. Wheel arches began to bubble within the first year on some examples. Door sills deteriorated. The boot floor on some early cars showed signs of corrosion before the car had accumulated enough miles to justify its first service. There were electrical gremlins, because this was a British car of the 1970s, and electrical gremlins were essentially a standard feature across the entire domestic industry, regardless of manufacturer or model. Lucas Electrics, which supplied most of the British motor industry with its wiring, switches and components, had by this point acquired a reputation so fearsome that mechanics told joke about it, and the jokes were considerably less funny if you were the person standing in the rain with a torch trying to find out why nothing was working. There were also reports, which British Leyland disputed vigorously, that an Allegro submerged in water, as happened during flood testing, had its rear window pop out due to the body flexing. The image of an Allegro with no rear window sitting in a water tank became one of the decade's most persistently repeated automotive stories, whether or not every detail of every version was strictly accurate. What was entirely accurate was the experience of thousands of ordinary British families who bought Allegros in good faith, needed a reliable family car, and spent more time than they had budgeted for at their local dealer having things attended to that should not have required attending to in a vehicle of that age and mileage. The Allegro's problems would have been serious in any era. In the early 1970s, they were fatal because the competition was improving at exactly the moment British Leyland was struggling. Ford's Escort wasn't exciting or technically adventurous. It was simply well-built, reliable and sensibly priced. A car that started every morning and asked relatively little of its owner. For an enormous number of British families, that was enough. Then came Volkswagen's Golf, launched in 1974, the year after the Allegro, which demonstrated immediately what a modern small hatchback could be when executed with clarity and precision. It had a tailgate. The standard Allegro did not. Buyers could walk across the forecourt, open the Allegro's conventional boot, then open the Golf's tailgate. And the comparison was not one that favoured the British car. A hatchback Allegro was eventually produced, not until 1975, 2 years after launch, by which time the damage was done. At this point, it's only fair to pause and acknowledge that the Allegro was not entirely without merit, because the complete picture is more complicated than the legend suggests, and the men and women who bought one and got on perfectly well with it deserve some acknowledgement. The ride quality, even accounting for the early suspension settings, was genuinely good on motorways and smoother A roads. Over long distances at a steady speed, the Allegro was a more comfortable car than most of its rivals. Passengers in the back reported this with some frequency. The interior space was reasonable, better than the exterior dimensions suggested in the tradition of its Isigonis-designed predecessors. A family of 4 could travel in the Allegro without the children staging a territorial dispute in the back seat, which was more than could be said for some of the competition. The engines, particularly the later 1500 A-series unit, were willing and reasonably economical, not inspiring but adequate for the purpose and not prone to the dramatic mechanical failures that plagued some of the competition. The Allegro Sport, produced in small numbers, was actually a moderately entertaining car to drive. Lighter steering, firmer suspension, enough performance to make the driver feel that something was happening. It wasn't fast by any objective measure, but it had a character that the standard car entirely lacked, and owners of the Sport tended to speak about it with a warmth that Allegro owners generally weren't expected to display. And it sold, in considerable numbers for many years. Over 1 million Allegros were produced between 1973 and 1983. 1 million British families bought one, drove it, and got where they were going. That doesn't make it a good car, but it makes it a more complicated failure than the jokes suggest. By the late 1970s, the Allegro's position in the market had become increasingly difficult to defend. The Allegro received revisions, new grilles, revised trim levels, updated interiors, in the way that aging models receive revisions when the manufacturer cannot afford to replace them entirely. The car that replaced the Allegro in 1983 was the Austin Maestro, a genuinely better car in almost every measurable respect, with a proper tailgate and improved build quality. The Allegro was quietly discontinued and, outside of the jokes that would follow it for decades, largely forgotten by people who hadn't owned one. The Austin Allegro failed for reasons that go deeper than a square steering wheel or a bulbous body shape, and understanding those reasons tells you something important about what was happening to British manufacturing in the 1970s. It failed because it was designed and built by a company that was simultaneously too large to be agile and too fragmented to be coherent. It failed because the competition, both domestic and European, was improving at a pace that British Leyland could not match with the resources, the focus, or the organisational coherence that would have been required to keep up. And it failed, perhaps most fundamentally, because it replaced a genuinely excellent car, a car that had earned the trust of millions of British families over more than a decade. With something that those families looked at and drove and lived with and concluded with some sadness and some irritation wasn't as good as what it had replaced. The Austin Allegro arrived with promise, stumbled on arrival and spent a decade being compared unfavourably to almost everything parked next to it. It wasn't entirely without merit, but it was never what it needed to be. A cautionary tale about what happens when a great industry loses its way. If this brought back memories, as good or bad, please do subscribe to Simply Britain, and the next video is already waiting for you on screen right now.